2 para were ordered to mount a diversionary raid on the settlement of Goose Green, 15 miles from the beachhead at San Carlos. There, 1,500 Argentine troops were thought to be holding 100 islanders prisoner. 2 para's commanding officer, Colonel Herbert Jones, known as H, set off on foot with only 400 men. Despite a lack of ammunition and inadequate artillery support, a decision was made in London to capture Goose Green. Chris Keeble was his second in command.
So H turned raid into capture, but the logistics stayed the same. The resources for the task stayed the same. So there was always a mismatch between capturing Goose Green and the resources available.
2 para walked to Goose Green through the night from San Carlos. Goose Green was at the end of a long, thin strip of land.
This was a narrow corridor. We were fighting down a very narrow corridor. Very open terrain, no cover, which makes it very difficult to fight a battle. It's midwinter, it's snowing, there's a 30-40 knot wind.
The Argentines' front line of trenches was 2 miles from Goose Green. After hiding during the day, the paras attacked the following night. Cameras weren't there to record the bloody hand-to-hand combat.
This was gutter fighting, trench by trench, fighting up across the open terrain to get to the trench. Closing with the enemy, grenade, burst of machine gun fire, bayonet if necessary, moving on, consolidating, moving on, keeping the momentum going.
At dawn, after 4 hours of fighting, they encountered the main Argentine defensive positions behind a line of gorse across Darwin Hill.
Our attack started to falter at that point, really, as we encountered the resistance of that defensive line.
David Abels was a young corporal.
There was chaos. It was chaos everywhere. Fighting up the gully itself.
Take move! My left!
A couple of the section commanders from 2 platoon had been either killed or injured. But we could see something like 17 or 18 trenches at the top of the hill. So what we were trying to do was go up to the top of the hill and look for the best place to attack these trenches from. And at the top was the sniper. But every time we went up, we lost people with headshots, and that's why we know it was the sniper. And we were up and down this hill for about 7 or 8 times, and we always lost or got somebody injured in the process.
A Company was spearheading the attack, but it was down to 2 platoons, 70 men fighting 200 entrenched Argentinians. The paras hadn't slept for 2 grueling days, and casualties were mounting. To break the deadlock, Colonel H. Jones put his own life on the line. In an unusual move for a commanding officer, H went forward into the Gorse Gully, the heart of the battle.
H had obviously and rightly gone to the place in his battalion where the greatest threat lay. I think because A Company were down to 2 platoons, it had severely limited their mobility. They'd very little. Any unit that's only got 2 subunits has lost its manoeuvrability, really.
Colonel Jones led by example. With utmost gallantry, he led an attack on enemy trenches on Darwin Hill.
The last thing I heard was Colonel Jones shouting, "Come on, A Company, get your skates off," and then disappeared. He disappeared out the corner of my eye, and I said to my friend Jerry Toole, I said, if he goes around there, he's ready, he'll get killed.
Colonel Jones was shot from this trench and mortally wounded.
We tried to give him first aid initially. He was still alive, but because I'd seen the way my friend died and I could see it in his eyes, I thought that The way his eyes looked at me, I slapped him across the face a few times. I thought, nah, he's going to go.
We had a prearranged code word, and the phrase was sunray, which was the radio language for a commanding officer. Sunray is down was passed to me, and I heard that back up at our command and control headquarters. And so I said to say again, and the operator transmitted this phrase to me again. And I then suddenly realized the seriousness of what had happened and imagined that H had been injured in some way. And I now had to take command.
Despite H's courage, the situation remained desperate. The Paras had lost the initiative. Keble had to find a way to break the enemy's will. "11 a.m., May the 28th. After 12 hours of fighting, two Paras' battle to liberate Goose Green had ground to a halt. Colonel H. Jones, their commanding officer, was dead, and Chris Keble, his number 2, had to pick up the gauntlet.
Warfare, for me, is a contest of wills in which you use violence to persuade the enemy to change his mind, to break his will.
With stealth, some of Keble's exhausted men got to within point-blank range of the Argentine trenches and fired anti-tank rockets.
The Sergeant Major fired a 66 at what we thought was a command trench, but just missed it. I fired one, and it hit a command trench. And then all of a sudden, the Argentinians on the top of the hill surrendered.
Darwin Hill had fallen. News cameras recorded the high casualties on both sides. The total strength of the Paras was down to just over 300 men.
All I could see was a row of about 30 casualties, both English and Argentinian. Everything from head wounds, stomach wounds, shot in the legs, shot in the arms. And it didn't matter who they were actually put in an order of the priority of the seriousness of their injury. So you'd have an Argentinian, para-reg Argentinian.
Corporal Abels won the Distinguished Conduct Medal for his actions at Darwin Hill, but the battle wasn't won. A mile away over the brow of Darwin Hill lay Goose Green and 1,300 Argentine troops. Then at 3:30, with his men exhausted and virtually out of ammunition, Chris Keble finally managed to call in air support.
We had been appealing to the brigade to bring in an airstrike. If we could bring in a cluster bomb attack on the outskirts of Goose Green, this would be a real clincher. And by sunset, 3 Harriers came in and dropped the CBUs, cluster bombs, around the settlement. And it was like somebody switching the light out. The whole battlefield just went quiet as this awesome amount of ordnance landed in the space of half a second around the settlement. We had not just been fighting, we'd been awake for something like 60 hours, on and off. And by that night, when I was up in the gully behind Darwin Hill, I was exhausted and was carrying the burden of command, which is very lonely. And something like 1 in 6 of us was injured or killed. I went down this gully to meet my company commanders, or 2 of them, and they looked at me as if in a kind of final appeal. So what are we going to do now, boss? And I had no idea. So I knelt down in the gorse line and I said this prayer. My Father, I abandon myself to you. Do with me as you will. Whatever your will is for you, I accept it. And it was quite extraordinary. I suddenly felt absolutely clear what I needed to do. And I walked back up to the company commanders and I said, I know exactly what we're going to do here. I'm going to engage with the enemy in some kind of negotiation. And I'm going to contact the enemy and invite them to have a surrender.
Many lives had been lost. Keeble's stratagem was to stop more. Believing the Argentines' will was broken and wishing to spare their lives and the settlers imprisoned by them, he sent a message to their commander. The Red Berets are the best soldiers in the world. Surrender or face the consequences.
I said, if you don't surrender, we'll dump this ordnance on you and continue the battle, and we will fight to capture Goose Green.
The gamble on Chris's part was that we were relying on the Argentines not knowing exactly how few we were. And we were very, very few. We were few when we started, and by the time we'd reached this stage of the battle, we were well down in our numbers. I think had they known how few we were, they may well have decided to continue fighting.
Their will had gone, and they wanted to concede. And they wanted to concede with dignity. So we arranged for them to surrender as soldiers, not as defeated soldiers. So they formed up in a hollow square outside Goose Green. The Argentine commander saluted me and handed me his pistol, and I invited his soldiers to lay down their weapons. It was something like 1,500, I think, who formed up and formed a hollow square and laid down their weapons.
And the dead were subsequently evacuated back to Ajax Bay, where they were buried in a trench grave with all the dead from Goose Green of our side. I took the service.
Lieutenant Colonel Jones, Captain Dent, Lieutenant Barry, Corporal Hardman.
War is just one dreadful sight after another. It is difficult to describe what war's like to a person who's never been in it. In fact, I'd say it's impossible.
Lance Corporal Smith, Lance Corporal Bingley, Private Holman Smith, Private Fletcher, Private Illingsworth, Private Meakin, Private Dixon, Lieutenant Nunn.
Killing is something that we don't normally do. A battlefield is a highly immoral environment. I'd like to think of myself as a Christian warrior, and the way I translate that into practical action is that as an officer, I am responsible for trying to make violence, killing, justified, legitimate. I have to have some rationale that sustains the legitimacy of what I'm doing.
Ashes to ashes, dust to dust.
We'd 17 killed at Goose Green, of whom 3/4 were officers or NCOs. It tells me that the parachute regiment's got some very good leaders.
Goose Green signalled to the Argentines the determination of the British to succeed.